Welcome, dear listeners, to another gripping detective story that will immerse you in a world where the lines between truth and deception blur, and the stakes are as high as the political game itself. Today, we present to you a masterpiece from the unparalleled Agatha Christie, The Silent Web of Power. In this fascinating tale, Hercule Poirot once again finds himself embroiled in a case where every word spoken, every glance exchanged, and every secret kept could mean the difference between justice and corruption. This story draws inspiration from one of the great tasks of the mythological hero Hercules, the legendary labor of cleansing the Augean stables. In Greek mythology, this seemingly impossible feat involved diverting rivers to wash away years of accumulated filth and decay. But in Agatha Christie's world, this task is far more complex, with no rivers to be redirected, only the murky world of political scandal and corruption that threatens to engulf everything in its path. Hercule Poirot is called upon to untangle a web of lies, power struggles, and hidden agendas, much like Hercules himself faced the task of purging the stables of their filth. However, the challenge in the silent web of power is no mere physical one. It is a battle of minds and wills, a race against time where each player in this political drama must navigate the fine line between maintaining appearances and confronting uncomfortable truths. The story delves deep into the delicate balance of power, where one wrong move could topple a nation's government or shatter the carefully curated image of its leaders. As Hercule Poirot sits in the midst of this tense atmosphere, he is forced to confront not just the faceless criminals lurking in the shadows, but also the very system of power itself. The political figures involved are not merely individuals. They are symbols of trust, tradition, and security. The narrative explores how far these men will go to preserve their carefully constructed facades, even as the truth threatens to unravel everything they have worked so hard to protect. This case is particularly personal for Poirot, as the situation is wrapped in a web of loyalty, betrayal, and moral ambiguity. What begins as a whisper of scandal soon becomes a roaring tide of revelations that may very well destroy the lives of the people involved. The challenge, however, lies in finding out which pieces of the puzzle are true, and which are fabrications meant to hide the real criminals. Poirot must sift through the muck of misinformation, searching for the one truth that will bring clarity to the chaos and restore justice to a society teetering on the edge of scandal. Agatha Christie's genius shines through as she crafts a narrative that echoes the great classical themes of mythology, while remaining firmly grounded in the political intrigue and corruption of the modern world. The story reflects her deep understanding of human nature, how power corrupts, how ambition blinds, and how, ultimately, the truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply it's buried. So, dear listeners, settle in for a tale of suspense, drama, and clever deduction. Prepare to follow Hercule Poirot as he navigates the treacherous waters of politics, corruption, and deceit. In the silent web of power, every revelation is a step closer to the truth, but it is never clear who will benefit when the web finally unravels. As Edward Ferrer paused, there was a moment of hesitation, a brief, almost imperceptible break in his calm composure, before he began to speak. His words came carefully, methodically, each one weighted with the gravity of the situation. He outlined the story with the precision of a man who had rehearsed this moment, but who could not quite hide the weight of the burden it carried. It was not an edifying story, far from it. The charges he spoke of were monstrous in their implication, casting a dark shadow over the legacy of the late Prime Minister, John Hammett. Accusations of shameless chicanery, the juggling of funds for personal gain, and a grotesque misuse of party resources. The evidence pointed to Hammett as a dishonest rogue, a gigantic confidence trickster who had used his power to amass an enormous private fortune while the nation turned a blind eye. The air in the room grew thick with tension as Ferrer's voice trailed off. His words hung in the air, too heavy to dissipate quickly, and Sir George Conway, ever the politician, could only groan in disbelief. "It's monstrous! Monstrous!" he spat, his face flushed with anger. "This fellow Perry, who edits that rag, ought to be shot." Hercule Poirot, calm as ever, raised an eyebrow and then spoke, his voice cool and measured. "These so-called revelations, they are to appear in the X-ray news?" he asked. The Prime Minister nodded grimly. Poirot's expression did not change, but his mind was already racing. The X-ray news was known for its sensationalism, but this was something entirely different. The truth, as always, had a way of slipping through cracks, finding its way to the light, no matter how hard people tried to keep it buried. "What steps do you propose to take about this?" Poirot asked, his tone sharp but not unkind. Ferrer's response was slow, deliberate, as though weighing the consequences of every word. "It's a private attack on John Hammett's reputation," he began. "It's within his rights to sue the paper for libel, but—" He paused, and Poirot watched him carefully. "But he won't, will he?" Poirot asked, finishing the thought. "No," Ferrer admitted, his voice tinged with a quiet resignation. "It's likely that the publicity surrounding a lawsuit would be enormous. The X-ray news would defend itself by claiming fair comment and the truth of the statements. The case could be drawn out in the public eye for months, perhaps even years. If they lose, the damages would be considerable, but there's a good chance they won't lose." Sir George, visibly shaking with outrage, looked at Ferrer as if he had lost his mind. "Edward, you can't seriously be suggesting that these allegations are true?" he asked, his voice rising. Ferrer only sighed and looked down, his expression weary. "What I am saying, George, is that the truth is uncomfortable. It's not something we want to admit, but it's the truth nonetheless." Sir George's face reddened as he sputtered, clearly unable to reconcile the man he had revered with this shocking revelation. Poirot, ever the observer, looked between the two men, sensing a deeper frustration bubbling beneath the surface. He could see that Ferrer was not just speaking of a political dilemma, but of something far more personal. The Prime Minister was grappling with the painful realization that the man who had once been the beacon of decency and honor, the very symbol of the People's Party, was now a symbol of betrayal. Ferrer continued, his voice growing more solemn. "John Hammett. He was the People's Party. He was everything we stood for. Decency, honesty, the very foundation of what this country was built on. We were never brilliant, never flashy, but we were trusted. The public believed in us." He paused, running a hand through his hair, his voice cracking with emotion. "And now the truth comes out. The man we trusted, the man we thought was above reproach, was nothing but a criminal, a crook who used his power to steal from the very people he was supposed to protect." Another groan escaped Sir George as the weight of the situation crushed him. "I had no idea," he muttered, his voice barely audible. Ferrer's gaze hardened. "I didn't either, George. At least, not until the truth started to leak out. My wife, though, she knew. She understood her father better than I ever did. She could see what I couldn't. When the truth began to surface, I was horrified, but I couldn't deny it. We forced him to resign, citing health issues. Then, we tried to clean up the mess." Sir George, clearly unable to cope with the full scope of what was unfolding, collapsed into his chair, muttering under his breath. Poirot, who had been quietly listening, spoke up. "I understand," he said softly. "This situation is not unlike the cleansing of the Augean stables. It requires a Herculean effort. something monumental, a force of nature. Ferrer looked up at him, eyes filled with a weary resolve. Exactly. This is beyond us, beyond anything we could have prepared for. Once the public knows, the government will fall. There will be a general election, and most likely Everard's party will take over. His voice grew darker. Everard is a firebrand. He has the ability, but he is reckless, belligerent. His supporters are weak, indecisive. If he rises to power, it could very well lead to a dictatorship. Poirot nodded slowly, absorbing every word. And you wish to avoid this disaster? Ferrer nodded. The only hope we have is for something miraculous to happen. But I fear that even a Herculean effort might not be enough. He gave Poirot a sharp look. That's why I sent for you. I need someone who can see beyond the ordinary, someone who might perform the impossible. Poirot's lips curled into a small smile. You think I might be able to perform miracles, Monsieur Ferrer? Edward Ferrer did not flinch, though the weight of his responsibility bore down on him. I don't know if you can perform miracles, but I do know this. If salvation is possible, it will come from something completely unorthodox. A suggestion, an idea, that no one else would even consider. Poirot considered this, then spoke again. But, perhaps, you take an ethical view of this situation, yes? You wonder if it's even possible to rebuild on such dishonest foundations. Ferrer smiled wryly. I don't know, Poirot, I don't know. But I want to try. Poirot stood up slowly, his expression unreadable. I have seen many things in my career, Monsieur Ferrer. Politics. It has never been a field I've held in high regard. But I do know this. If John Hammett had been in office, I would not have lifted a finger to help him. Not even a little finger. Ferrer nodded solemnly. I understand. Poirot paused, then added, But I have also been told by someone great, someone whose opinion I trust, that you are a sound man, Monsieur Ferrer. And for that, I will do what I can. And with that, Hercule Poirot rose and bowed, his face unreadable as he left the room. Hercule Poirot entered the room with a calm yet piercing air about him. The tall woman before him, Dagmar Ferrer, had a presence that commanded attention. With her tall frame and striking intelligence in her eyes, she was not just the Prime Minister's wife. She was an embodiment of the nation's ideal of womanhood. A devoted wife, a loving mother, and a popular figure in public life, Dagmar had long been admired by the masses. Her public contributions, initiating charities, fighting for the welfare of the unemployed, and always embodying an aura of grace, made her a figure of reverence. But now, she was no longer just the wife of the Prime Minister. She was a woman in crisis, facing a storm that could tear down everything she had worked for. As she closed the door behind her and motioned for Poirot to sit, there was an unspoken weight in the air. You've just spoken with my husband, she said softly, her voice betraying the turmoil that stirred beneath the surface. And he's told you about my father. Poirot, ever perceptive, studied her face with careful attention. He saw the signs of strain, of a woman who had been carrying the weight of a terrible secret for far too long. Dagmar Ferrer, so poised, so perfect in the eyes of the public, was anything but that in private. Her father, John Hammett, the late Prime Minister, had been a fraud, a crook. And now, as the truth surfaced, it threatened to bring down not only her father's legacy, but everything her husband had worked for. I'm terribly worried, she admitted, her voice low. For years, I feared this day would come, but never like this. Poirot looked at her thoughtfully, his voice low and measured. You didn't know the full extent of it? He asked, his gaze unwavering. Dagmar shook her head, her eyes hardening with bitter realization. Number I only knew that he wasn't the man everyone thought he was. From the time I was a child, I knew he was a fraud. There was a quiet anger in her tone, a frustration born of years of silence and denial. She leaned forward, gripping the edge of the chair as though trying to steady herself. Edward, my husband, he'll lose everything because of me, because of what my father did. Poirot listened in silence. It was clear that Dagmar had lived with this burden for far too long. But her pain, her fear, was not just for herself. It was for her husband, her family, her life. And now Hercule Poirot was about to guide her through a fight that would test the very foundation of their lives. "Do you have enemies, madame?" Poirot asked, his voice sharp. Dagmar looked up at him, surprised. "Enemies? I don't think so." Poirot's eyes narrowed, a sharp glint in his gaze. "I think you do, a very dangerous one, and if we're not careful, there will be more." Her eyes widened in realization. "What are you saying?" Poirot leaned forward, his tone growing more urgent. "There is a campaign against your husband, against you, one that threatens everything you've built. You must be prepared to defend yourself." She flinched, as if the weight of his words had struck her harder than anything before. "But it's not about me. It's about Edward." Her voice trembled with emotion. "He's the one who will be destroyed by this." Poirot stood, his expression resolute. "You are Caesar's wife," he said firmly. "What happens to him will affect you as well. The storm will not pass you by." The air in the office crackled with tension as Hercule Poirot leaned forward, eyes gleaming with intent. "I've got a little scheme in mind," he said, his voice low but confident. "If my instincts are correct, we're about to expose a scandal that will make headlines for days. A plot so sensational it could shake the very foundations of this country." Dashwood, the young journalist with a taste for the dramatic, leaned in, eager. "A scandal, huh? What kind of scandal are we talking about?" Poirot's lips curled into a wry smile. "The kind that will make your paper the talk of the town, a scandal involving a woman. And I assure you, my friend, it's more than just dirt, it's dynamite." Dashwood chuckled. "Sex, politics, and scandal? Sounds like the perfect story to me." He adjusted his glasses, clearly already imagining the headlines. "Go on, I'm listening." People were gossiping in the Goose and Feathers pub in Little Wilmington, their voices a mixture of disbelief and curiosity. The subject of the latest whispers was none other than John Hammett, once hailed as a paragon of integrity. But now the truth was starting to leak out, and not in a way anyone had expected. John Hammett? Honest man? Never, one local muttered, shaking his head. He was part of the Palestine oil scam, just another crooked deal in a long line of shady business. All those politicians, they're just a bunch of thieves, crooks, and liars. You can't trust any of them. Another voice piped up with more gossip. I always knew there was something off about that family. And now look, his daughter, Mrs. Ferrer, involved in all sorts of trouble. What do you think of that? The crowd murmured their disapproval, eyes darting to a dog-eared copy of the X-ray News. "It's all in the papers," one man sneered, pointing to the front page. "They're saying Mrs. Ferrer's been spotted in strange places, and with a gigolo." The word hung in the air like an accusation. Gasps filled the pub as more hushed voices joined the conversation. "No way, Mrs. Ferrer, but she's so proper, always opening bazaars and helping the poor. This can't be true." Another woman chimed in, her tone full of suspicion. "You never know with women, darling. They're all the same. Naughty, naughty, naughty. But that's just what they want you to think. Beneath it all, they're all just looking for a good time." The scandal spiraled out of control as the gossip continued to spread like wildfire. Dagmar Ferrer, the beloved Prime Minister's wife, was being painted as something far darker than anyone could have imagined. The whispers grew louder, more salacious, and soon it seemed as if everyone had their own version of the truth. "I heard it from Naomi," one woman whispered. "She says Mrs. Ferrer's a nymphomaniac, and she's been living a double life for years. Don't be ridiculous," another scoffed. "This is just some twisted rumor. But I have to admit, there's no smoke without fire." Meanwhile, in the halls of power, Edward Ferrer, his face drawn with stress, confronted Poirot. "These attacks on my wife, they're pure lies, filthy, baseless lies," he seethed, his voice trembling with anger. "I'm taking legal action. I won't let them ruin her." Poirot's calm demeanor never wavered as he regarded the Prime Minister. "I would advise against taking legal action. It will only fuel the fire." "What do you mean?" Edward asked, clearly at his wits' end. Poirot's gaze was sharp as he considered the situation. "You think these lies are the worst they can do? Believe me, they're just getting started. And your wife, she has a part to play in this. A big one." Edward stared at him in disbelief. "What are you suggesting?" Before Poirot could answer, the next bombshell hit the news. Mrs. Ferrer has suffered a slight nervous breakdown and is retreating to Scotland to recuperate. But the story didn't end there. It was only the beginning of a series of rumors and reports that suggested something much darker was at play. People were talking. Whispers of Mrs. Ferrer's supposed wild escapades spread like wildfire. She was seen in Paris, drunk and doped up with some Argentinian dancer. "A disgrace," one voice claimed. "She's been living in secret for years. Nobody knew what she was really up to." The scandal grew more lurid with every passing day. The once admired Mrs. Ferrer was now being painted as a reckless, scandalous woman, drunk, drugged, and involved with shady figures from all over the world. And the most shocking part? The photographs, grainy but damning, emerged from the shadows, showing Mrs. Ferrer in compromising positions. Her arm draped over a dark-skinned, sinister-looking man. Another photo on a beach, her head resting on his shoulder in a moment of intimate affection. The headlines screamed with accusations. The nation was in an uproar. How could this have happened? How could someone so beloved, so admired, fall so far? And then came the lawsuit. Mrs. Ferrer's legal team, led by the venerable Sir Mortimer Inglewood K.C., fought back with all their might, declaring that the attacks were nothing but a vile, concerted attempt to destroy her reputation. The case was framed as a grand conspiracy, a plot as treacherous as any political scandal in history. But what followed would prove to be even more explosive than anyone could have imagined. As the court drama drew to a close, Hercule Poirot leaned back in his chair, his sharp eyes never leaving Edward Ferrer's face. "Tell us, Mr. Ferrer, what exactly happened on March 18th?" he asked, his voice filled with a subtle challenge. The room fell silent, and all attention turned to Thelma Anderson, the Danish woman whose testimony had rocked the case. She spoke slowly, her accent thick as she recounted the strange events that had led her to this moment. "There was a gentleman," she began, "an Englishman who came to my table. He told me he worked for an English paper, the X-Ray News." "You're sure it was the X-Ray News?" Poirot interjected, a knowing glint in his eyes. "Yes," she said firmly. "At first I thought it was a medical paper, but it was not. He told me that a famous English film actress needed a stand-in and that I was the perfect match." The courtroom was hanging on her every word. Thelma continued, detailing how she had been offered £500, half of it up front, and flown to Paris. She had been given new clothes and an escort, an Argentine gentleman named Ramon, who was most respectful. It all seemed too good to be true, but Thelma had taken the money and quit her job. Her voice shook slightly as she described her time with Ramon. "I had no idea that it was for Mrs. Ferrer," she confessed, her face flushed with embarrassment. "They never told me her name. I only knew that I had to pretend to be someone else for the sake of some advertisements." The courtroom buzzed as Thelma described her experiences in Paris and the Riviera, places that, while glamorous, weren't exactly the most respectable. She was photographed in compromising positions, but she had been told it was all part of the plan. "It was all for advertisement," she repeated, looking utterly sincere. It was clear to everyone that Thelma Anderson was no villain. She was simply a woman caught in a web of deception, a pawn in a much larger game. Her honesty was undeniable, but it was the photographs, taken in nightclubs and on beaches, that told a different story. Sir Mortimer Inglewood's closing speech was nothing short of a master class in rhetoric. "This," he declared passionately, "is a dastardly political plot aimed at ruining the Ferrers' reputation. A campaign designed to destroy the very fabric of our democracy by discrediting those in power." The crowd hung on every word, their emotions swelling in sympathy for the wronged Prime Minister and his wife. The verdict, when it came, was a foregone conclusion. The X-ray news was destroyed in a single stroke. The courtroom erupted in applause as Mrs. Ferrer was vindicated, her name cleared of any wrongdoing. As the Ferrer family exited the court, they were met with cheers from the crowd. Edward Ferrer clapped Puo on the back, gratitude in his eyes. "I can't thank you enough, Hercule. You've saved my wife and exposed the lies for what they were. The X-ray news is finished, and they got what they deserved." Puo, ever the picture of calm, simply nodded. "It was my pleasure, Mr. Ferrer. But tell me, what made you think of the double? The idea seemed too perfect." Edward looked puzzled. "It's an old tactic, isn't it, like the case of the Queen's necklace? But how did you find the woman? Where did she come from?" Puo smiled enigmatically. "It wasn't by chance. You see, I knew Mrs. Ferrer's grandmother was Danish, and Dagmar herself has the strong features of a Danish woman. There were other reasons as well. A woman with the right look was waiting for me in Denmark." Edward's eyes widened. "But how did you know to look there?" "Because sometimes the past holds the key to solving the future," Puo replied, his voice laced with mystery. "And sex, well, that's always been the greatest force of nature. It's what sells stories, what stirs up scandal. Politics can't compete with it." Edward's breath caught. "Wait, you mean this whole thing was a setup, a way to bring down the X-ray news?" "Exactly," Puo nodded. "It was a river of mud, dirt thrown at Caesar's wife to discredit her. But in the end, it's a far more powerful story. The public eats it up. They love a scandal, and that's what I gave them." Edward stared at him, half in disbelief. "But to use my wife like that—" At that moment the door opened, and in walked Dagmar Ferrer, her serene smile lighting up the room. "Well," she said, "that went off very well, didn't it?" "You knew all along?" Edward asked, his voice thick with emotion. "Of course, darling," she replied with a gentle smile. "But you would never have let Hercule do it without knowing everything first. We, he and I, had a plan from the beginning." Puo nodded, a subtle admiration in his eyes. Dagmar's presence was pure grace. "I had a very restful time with the dear bishop," she added, "and now I feel full of energy again. They want me to christen the new battleship at Liverpool next month. It will be quite the popular event." As the Ferrers left the room, a wave of relief seemed to wash over them. The case was over, the lies had been exposed, and the truth had triumphed. The scandalous plot against Mrs. Ferrer had been laid bare, and with it, the power of the press had been brought into question. What a tangled web the press had woven, and what a delicious unraveling it had been.